Okay, science time. We're talking today about the big word evolution. Give me a nice, neutral, basic definition of the word evolution. Okay, we probably can't use that. The word evolution. Okay, it doesn't have to be getting better, but we're gonna take that what you said. It doesn't have to be getting better, but it's changing over time. Changing over time. The word originally, it's from the Latin evoluare, I think, or something like that, where the unrolling of a scroll, like the flipping of the pages of a book, like something being progressive, something happening. The idea being that these changes take place over the course of time. Changing in what over time? Well, I like this very basic definition because we know that when we talk about evolution as a concept biologically, which is what we're doing today, we're talking about a specific natural phenomenon that we can observe in the world. But we use that word in other ways too. We might say that something like my understanding of the way gasoline works has evolved over time. It has changed over time. Streety, maybe your ideas about basketball have evolved over time. I know you're a baller. But what that means is that any kind of progressive change. Remember, the root word is something like the unrolling of a scroll. As something goes on, as something changes, there is an evolution. So in this context, though, we're specifically talking about, in biology, we're talking about the changes in life over time. Changes in life over time. Have you ever seen these quotes being used as ditto before? So changing in life over time. Have you ever seen that? Quotes from the line above meaning ditto. So it's also, you know what, maybe I don't need to teach you another English thing. I'll just rewrite it. Changing in life over time. We would call that biological evolution. Evolution. Biological evolution. That's what we're specifically talking about today. We've addressed the concerns that people sometimes have with this topic before, but to me, one of the things it boils down to is that we can observe change in all kinds of capacities. And so to make an assumption that things don't change, to me, is contrary to observation, but that amounts to my opinion. Remember, there are lots of direct and indirect evidence for this. We talked about several of them right before Christmas break. We talked about things like common ancestry and homologous structures and fetal resemblance and things like that tell us that life as a group has changed over time. But now we're talking about the mechanism, the way that happens. So how does it happen? How? In 1780, your book says, in 1780, there was an island of people living on an island. And a tsunami came, and everyone died but 20 people. And that's sad in 1780 for that to happen. But of those 20 people, one of them was colorblind. And that's a genetic trait. To be colorblind is a genetic trait. And to this day, even though that was in 1780, to this day, about 1 in 12 people who lives on that island is colorblind because one of the people, of the 20 who survived, was colorblind. And as that person, does what people eventually do and reproduced, their offspring had a higher chance of being colorblind. And those people's offspring had a higher chance of being colorblind, et cetera, down to today, where there's a 1 in 12 chance of a person being colorblind on the island because of their ancestor had that trait. So the evolution involves the passing on of genetic traits. We call these alleles. An allele is a trait that is coded for genetically. Do you know what I mean when I say coded for? We'll talk about genes in a second, but basically your genes tell you how to build up the proteins. I don't mean that. What I just said was kind of incorrect. Your genes are the instructions for your cells on how to build protein, and that results in different structures. The protein is what you're actually made out of. The part of you that is you. Do you remember the macromolecules from 7th grade science? What are the major biological macromolecules? What are you made out of? What are you mostly made out of? Water. You're made out of cells, which are themselves mostly water. A cell is basically a little water balloon in an oil sac. So you're mostly made of water, and there are some lipids, which are fats. There are nucleic acids that make up the genes themselves, and protein. And the part that makes you, and the way that we think of a thing being alive and talking and walking, is largely protein. So you're built, the Legos that build you up, if you was a Lego castle, are the proteins. And those proteins, the way that they are expressed, the way those Legos are used to build a structure, so to speak, are the traits. What are some traits that you have? We're not going to get too in depth in this, but let's look at as a case. Look over there at Aiden Streety and Tristan Gillette. Do you see them? What are some traits that they have? Do they have the same kind of hair?
Yeah.
No. Okay, let's try again. Do they have the same kind of hair?
No.
No, they don't have the same kind of hair. That's a trait. Do they have the same shape of ears?
No.
No. Do they have the same color of eyes? Maybe, but not exactly, you wouldn't say. Right? There's all different things that are different about them, and those are traits. If you think about two dogs, does anyone have more than one dog? Raise your hand if you've got more than one dog in your house. Are there differences between those dogs?
No. Yes. But pickle. That's the one.
I'm not going to talk to you. Are there differences in the dogs?
Yes.
Yeah, and that's because of their traits. They have different traits. Different proteins are expressed differently because of their genetic code, and we call those genetic traits alleles. Now, there are traits that can be non-genetic. The way my hair is cut is a non-genetic trait. Right? To some extent, the color of my hair will determine the color of his hair, to some extent. Because my son, has traits that came from his parents, me and my wife. Okay? So to some extent, the traits that we have, the genetic traits that we have passed on, determine his. Let's write that down. Genetic traits are, let me change that to can be. No, I want to keep it are passed to offspring by parents. Not all traits, but genetic traits. Well, you might say one of the traits that I have, it's not a genetic trait, but one of the traits I have is the way my hair is cut, and that will not be passed on to my son, the way my hair is cut. The hairline, maybe, the hair color, maybe, but not the way it's cut. If I, God forbid it, if I lose my arm in a skiing accident, it's not a bad skiing accident to lose your arm, but I am bad at skiing. If I lose my arm in a skiing accident, my one-armedness will not be passed on to my future offspring. You see what I mean? The classic example of this is that this is not how, I'm going to give you a non-example. This is not how giraffes evolved. Something with a normal sized neck, and then over the course of its life, it's like always stretching, and so then its kid is born with a slightly longer neck because its dad always stretched. That does not work. That is not how evolution works. You running fast your whole life does not mean your offspring will run faster. You see, but you said that's kind of a funny difference, but you see the distinction. Genetic traits are those things that are coded for by your cells. They're part of your makeup, and those are passed on. The things that you choose or happen to do during your life is not passed on. Now, that having been said, there are some exceptions of things like, what do we call it, epigenetics, where some things can happen in your life that can change your genes, which we call mutations, and those do get passed on, but it has to be a change in the genes. Only genetic changes are passed on. So from that, was the color blindness that 1 in 12 people on that island that I mentioned earlier have, is that a genetic trait? Yeah, we know that color blindness is genetic. It comes from parents that are colorblind are more likely to have offspring that are colorblind. And one of the results of that is that those people on that island are more likely now to be colorblind because that man so long ago was colorblind. It has changed over time. Now that thing that I just mentioned is recorded history. Can anyone doubt that it changed over time? No, there's a record of it. There's almost direct evidence of it. But it gets a little bit more murky when we look further back in time at things like, well, what was our most recent common ancestor with the other primates? Well, that becomes a little bit more murky because we're using things like fossil evidence, which is still good evidence. It just isn't direct evidence necessarily. Your genes are genetic code. Your genes or genetic code are made up of DNA. So DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is the kind of the code by which you're made. It's the instructions for how you are built. What are you built out of? We mentioned this already. So the instructions are relating to Legos, right? You as a Lego set. The genes are like the instructions that come with the Legos. What are the things that you're made of? What are the Legos themselves? No. No, for you, in our analogy. No. Proteins. Proteins. Which are made out of what from your lab, Streety? Amino acids. These are the building blocks.
What does the DNA?
It says code or instructions. And that helps us meet our objective, which is describe evolution in terms of genetic change. Make sure we write it down. Describe evolution in terms of genetic change. So the word evolution itself, remember, means just to change or to unfurl. But we're talking about it in terms of genetic change, in terms of the code or instructions that make up or that tell an organism how it should be made up from the proteins that do make it up. You see the relationship between these three things: traits, DNA, and proteins. Do you see the relationship between those? What's a trait?
What you get from your parents.
Yeah, it's what we see or maybe smell, but it's what we perceive as an attribute of an organism. How does DNA relate to that? How do the genes, which are coded for in DNA, how do they relate to that? Well, they're the instructions that tell how this trait should turn out, so to speak. And how do proteins relate to that? Well, that's what the structure is actually made out of. So the difference in shape between Tristan and Aiden's ears is because there are proteins that it's the same kind of protein, collagen, but it shapes itself differently as these two boys grow. Okay, does that make sense? The proteins are being built in a slightly different way, but it's the same kind of protein, but built in a slightly different way. Why? Because of the difference in genetic code they have, right? They have different traits because their genes are different. They have different parents. And even people with the same parents have different genes, different combinations because of the next thing. Now, this is what we're in 8th grade, so we love to talk about this, sexual reproduction. Yeah, this encourages, no, I shouldn't use that word. Let's say it causes greater genetic changes in a population. Why? Why does sexual reproduction result in that? What's special about, what's the alternative? What's different? What's the other way to reproduce? Not for us, but no, A is sexual reproduction. What's the other? Asexual reproduction. So have you never heard of these things before? Oh, okay. Well, asexual reproduction is reproduction without sex. So asexual reproduction is something like, there are these kinds like cloning, budding, fission, but there are some organisms that can do these. Like a sponge can asexually reproduce, where it just, part of it, or a starfish, its arm falls off, and that arm grows a whole new starfish, but it's genetically identical to the original starfish. That's asexual reproduction, where the genes are the same from generation to generation, roughly. Sexual reproduction is a recombination. It takes the genes from two individuals and scrambles them up. Exactly right. So there's a mother and a father. There's the mother and a father. We'll say these are dogs. No, let's keep it a little bit. They're fish. Let's say they're fish. So there's a female fish with a certain set of genes and a male fish with a certain set of genes, and they sexually reproduce, and it causes some offspring. First of all, the fact that the offspring is either male or female is itself an attribute of sexual reproduction. But this one will have a combination of its parents' genes. Is it the same as these? No, it's different. It changes over time. That's evolution. We can see this, right? Are you the same as your parents? No, you're not. Which of your parents are you the same as? Well, that's a silly question because you're not the same as either. You're a combination. You have a combination of their genes. Sometimes people say, oh, your son looks so much like you. And then sometimes people say, oh, your son looks so much like your wife. And I'm like, yeah, it's a change, right? You see, our son, my wife and I, our son is similar, but not the same as either of us. Similar to both of us, but not the same as either of us. Because he's a recombination of our genes. And that's change over time. And that's evolution. This on the small scale, no one argues with. But on the large scale, when we go back far enough, people start to say, well, it doesn't really make sense to me that there would be a monkey involved anywhere along the line. But that's just how it is. It's just the changes that we see on the small scale lead us to the conclusion that they change on the large scale too over time. So why do genes change? One thing is sexual reproduction. They recombine during sexual reproduction, but they also, what's the other word about how, what can I erase here? I guess I can put it after how. Another way they can have, so there are two hows here. How do things change over time? How do genes change over time? One can be genetic recombination. What's recombination mean? Well, they're recombining. The genes from both parents recombine, which is sexual reproduction, sex. How else? Well, mutation. Mutation. A mutation is a change in genes. It can be due to an outside circumstance in the environment. For instance, nuclear radiation. Radiation can cause mutations in genes. It can be random. Sometimes as your genes themselves in mitosis, when the cells divide, sometimes those genes get a little bit mixed up. They mutate a little bit. Now, if that mutation is negative, eukaryotic cells like yours have a way of destroying that cell so that negative mutation does not carry on. But mutations can also be beneficial. Mutations can be either neutral, positive, or negative. Neutral, beneficial, or detrimental. And what determines that? What determines if it's beneficial or detrimental to the organism? Like, how do we decide? Like some scientist or the universe itself says, nice job on your beneficial trait, homie. No. What determines if they're beneficial or detrimental or neutral? What they are? Whether or not they can do what? What determines the success of an organism? Yeah, if it can live and specifically reproduce. Yeah, good. I like that. How much riz it has. No, but if it can live and reproduce, that is biologically successful. So it's the environment that determines if it's a beneficial or detrimental trait. For instance, if the little a grasshopper is born, as some grasshoppers sometimes are, with erythritism, and it's born pink, is that a beneficial or detrimental trait? It might be neutral, but it's probably detrimental. Why? What's different about a pink grasshopper? It's easier to see. Now, is it that the universe or God or a scientist said, you're too easy to see, and so that's a bad trait. No, what determines if the trait's actually bad? It's eaten. It dies. It dies earlier than its non-pink comrades would have because it's more easy to see. Does that make sense? So it's the environment that determines this, and we call that natural selection, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. But first, do you have questions about any of this? Yeah, cherry blossom. Maybe, yeah. And I'm sure, you know what, there are mantids that are adapted to take the color of an orchid that they're on. And so some of these adaptations, sometimes, great point, Cameron, because in one context, an organism being pink might be beneficial, and in another context, it might be detrimental. And so it's, once again, the environment that determines whether a trait is beneficial or not. And we call that natural selection. Do you have questions about the kind of basic way evolution works? In one word, what is evolution? Change. Change. Change in specifically how usually it has to do with genes too. And that's what we talked about today. Do you have questions about any of this? I mean, this is kind of stuff that it should be a little bit review. We talked about common ancestry and the evidence for that. And so this is kind of just the next step beyond that. But we'll talk more about natural selection next time.